Let's bring in right now Republican South Carolina Governor Mark Sanford, who's also the chairman of the Republican Governors Association. Mark, very good to see you.
Always a pleasure.
Well, I'm a little upset, Mark. I'm not going to lie to you.
He's been upset.
I've got the president of the United States is saying that there's not much difference between the Republican position on this stimulus package and the Democratic position. Mark, are you doing okay there?
I'm sorry, I lost you for.
Yeah,
I can hear you now. What were you saying?
I was saying, Mark, that the president was claiming there's not a big difference between Republicans and Democrats on this stimulus package. It's kind of like saying that Karl Marx and Adam Smith didn't really have a great difference in how they viewed the economy. How bad is this stimulus bill?
I would agree, and there's a world of difference between where he is and where I am on this one, and where a number of Republicans are and where he is on this one.
Okay, talk about the dangers of this stimulus bill.
I think that there are several different dangers. I'd say one of the most immediate dangers is we're getting to something of a tipping point, I think, in the value of the dollar. And if you stack enough debt on top of debt, not only do you have long-term problems in terms of paying it back, and not only are there problems in solving a problem that was created by too much debt by adding more debt, but you really get to a tipping point with regard to the value of the dollar. I think that we're also running into this problem of undermining the real economic stimulus of this country, which is people going to work and people taking risks in the marketplace. Right now, you got a lot of private capital that has been frozen because nobody knows quite what the rules are going forward. And so I think we are at that point wherein we've frozen up the private markets actually by virtue of what government's doing. Those would be two of the problems, and I can list a lot more.
Well, you know, Mark, the Congressional Budget Office has estimated that this package, if passes, will increase the federal deficit by $233 billion more dollars this year alone, $461 billion next year. At what point do the Chinese say, we're not going to let you borrow any more money? And what point do interest rates go up and have a staggering impact on that $12 trillion debt this country's carrying?
The answer is I don't know exactly when. They seem to be hinting in that direction right now. I read an interesting article this morning in the Wall Street Journal talking about the head of Barclays believing that the rate on treasuries would be about 4.5. In other words, the rate would more than double by the end of the year. So we're getting awfully close to that point where investors say, wait a minute, given the amount of money that they're printing, I want more yield based on what I might believe to be coming our way with regard to inflation.
Yeah. And here's a concern, of course, Mika, we've been talking about it. You spend $1 trillion, you go further down that road to where interest rates start to skyrocket, Chinese and other international investors say we're not going to invest, and nothing good happens. How do we stimulate the economy, Mark? What would you do to stimulate this economy right now?
I would say, one, take a deep breath. There is this bias, as we both know, Joe, in the world of politics to, quote, do something now. We got to do something. And I think that what we want to get away from is this series of different ad hoc amendments that are all about, quote, doing something. So I'd say, one, calm down. Two, I would say we ought to do things that are in the long run best interest of this country. Marginal rates ultimately matter. Things like card check that are being talked about in the halls of Congress absolutely matter from the standpoint of competitiveness. In other words, we ought to look beyond simply the bubble we're in, but to the long-term things that will help our economy to be competitive. And I would also say this, if you're going to stimulate the economy, look at something like a payroll tax reduction. Do something that puts money into the pocket of the consumer now, because the Congressional Budget Office itself said with the stimulus package, a lot of these monies would not hit the street for another 2 years.
Mark,
that's a real problem in a...
A lot of what you're saying is being echoed by the conservative economist Martin Feldstein, who's written a lot about this, but it seems like at least no one in Congress on the Democratic side is listening. Want to bring into this conversation the host of CNBC's Fast Money and co-anchor of CNBC's The Call and Closing Bell, because he doesn't work enough, Dylan Ratigan. Also with us, Steve Forbes, chairman and CEO of Forbes Media and editor-in-chief of Forbes magazine. So let's continue with Governor Sanford. And Dylan, I mean, he does bring up some good points
he
about
brings up great points.
And wait a little bit. Just wait a little bit.
That's the big one right out of the gate. This whole idea that they're going on vacation on next Friday. You know how long it took us to screw up this system. We're going to try and redraw it with $1 trillion by next Friday before we go on vacation. Spare me. I'm curious, Governor, how you address some of the systemic issues. In other words, how do you, forget the spending versus tax cuts, how do you deal with the actual broken system? I don't care whether we cut taxes or not at this point until we actually deal with the system.
Well, I'd say part of that is accepting what nobody in politics wants to accept, which is that there will be pain. It seems like folks in politics' present job is simply to avoid pain at all costs. The reality is debt grew at 3 times GDP over the last 15 years. We're going to go through a deleveraging process, and we ought to be honest with the American public and saying there'll be some pain in going through that process. Or we can stick a lot of Band-Aids over it and pretend it doesn't exist.
Steve Forbes, we've had recessions before, but I have never seen Washington scurry the way they're scurrying now. And saying we've got to do everything right now. We've got to mortgage our future. We've got to spend trillions of dollars. Don't we need to do what the governor said and just take a deep breath, slow down, and make sure we get this right?
Well, the reason this crisis is different from other recessions, including that of the early 1980s, is that the financial system did nearly go into cardiac arrest in September. And the question really should be, how do we get the banking system working again? It's like the heart of the body. You can have a great body, but if the heart's not working, nothing else is going to work. And one of the things they should do is one of the most boring subjects in the world, but they refuse to face up to it, and that is get rid of this thing called mark-to-market, which is forcing banks to write down the value of loans, even if they're being serviced, interest being paid, principal being paid. And a good example, Joe, is Pfizer is going to buy a company called Wyeth. 1 year money, Pfizer's going to pay up to 9% interest. Why? Because every bank knows when they make a loan, even to a prime grade borrower, they're going to have to take a write-off on their capital. If we'd had that in the early 90s, remember the early 90s of the S&L crisis? Yep. If we'd had that in the early 90s, most of the commercial banks in this country would have failed and we'd have had a depression then. And Washington, why they don't get rid of this thing, which was put in a couple of years ago, is insane. You wouldn't need TARP. You wouldn't need a bad bank if you got rid of this thing. And it's insane.
Yeah, what are we going to do, though, about the bill that's
well, in terms of the bill right now, the best the Republicans can do is put up amendments and say, as the governor indicated, if you want real stimulus right away, why not cut the payroll tax in half, lower the price of labor, gives money into people's hands, encourages job creation, reduce tax rates. That's not going to cost a lot of money, but as you know from experience, it stimulates the economy. And on the housing side, the Federal Reserve, why aren't they out there buying mortgage-backed securities aggressively? So we have these 4 or 5% mortgages, but nobody can get it because the banks won't write them. The banks know they can sell those mortgages to the Fed or to Fannie or Freddie. They will write them. Why now not get housing moving again?
Why not just nationalize the banks? In other words, here's what let me finish. We've already put the money in. In other words, we already have the hard part of nationalization is putting a few $1 trillion of your money in. The easy part is then telling them what to do with it. And I'm curious, Governor Sanford, when you look at the amount of taxpayer money that has already gone into the banking system, and then you look at the level of authority the American people have over that money, how you reconcile that?
I don't think you do presently. Right now, the taxpayer is getting the short end of the stick, I believe. And again, in this desperate effort to do something, in fact, not that much is being done. Interesting statistic came out this week, which is the top recipients of TARP funding on a net basis have actually decreased their lending. And this, again, underscores the larger problem. In a balance sheet-driven problem, not a recession driven by excessive inventory, but in a balance sheet-driven problem, people go to restoring the balance sheet first. Okay. And we're missing, I think, part of the problem.
Part of the problem is regulators are telling banks, hoard cash, build up your balance sheet, and the banks know every time they make a loan, they take a hit to their balance sheet, so they're working at cross purposes.
All right. Governor Mark Sanford, thank you so much for being with us.
Pleasure.
Really
and we thank you for being one of the few governors that doesn't have your hat out asking for money because you believe.
You're trying to follow your lead, Joe.
Yeah, whatever. You know, Sanford and I always found ourselves alone in Newt Gingrich's office while they were screaming at us.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. We won that one, though, didn't we? We balanced the budget, brother.
Okay.
It's like high school again for you.
It is. This is like a high school reunion. Mark Sanford, thank you for being with us.
See you guys.